I'm excited. We all know what Ramsey
And how Ramsey County can be corrections.
David Dryland, geographer for hire, geographer at large.
Catherine Gray, Scanlon, and independent program evaluation consultant.
Jacob Gonzalez, but the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis.
Rich Davey from the Department of Labor and Industry.
Maron Malikan, Minnesota Compass. And again, I'm Allison Leaves. I'm a researcher here on the Minnesota Compass project at Wilder Research, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Jose Diaz, my colleague here at Wilder Research, who is our resident expert on return on investment and our main point of contact for our economic impact research unit here. So without further ado, I'll let Jose get into the details of ROI.
Thank you. I just have a very short introduction, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. I'm originally from Venezuela, South America. Have you heard about this country lately? We have big elections last year. We can talk about that later. I have a few things I could say. So yeah, we're going to talk today about social return investment. This presentation is a version of a presentation I did for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits annual conference and for the Minnesota Policy Conference. But I added a little bit more details and examples so you can have more fun. If I bore you with the first part, you already heard these. Sorry. So usually this crowd is really good at participating, so just feel free to stop me and ask questions or comments. And of course, you can write emails or Twitter, like Twitter. I have 74 followers, so I can get some more. So the plan for today is I'm gonna talk a little bit about the framework when we talk about social return investments, what we mean by that, and how can we put it in perspective compared to other techniques, I guess. And then we're going to jump into some details of how we do it, so you have an idea of what's behind the numbers. So let's jump right in. So the general framework for the ROI or return on investment, some people call it cost-benefit analysis. The return on investment sometimes is just this ratio, this division between benefits and cost. It's a concept that we borrow from the private sector. You put money in the bank or you invest in a business, and then at the end of some period of time, you get some money back and you compare how much it costs to produce these benefits. You pretty much divide them in the very simplest of the formulas, and then you get a number that if the number is larger than 1, you are in green, you are good, the benefits are larger than the cost. If it is lower than 1, then the costs are greater than the benefits, and then it's not, well, you can call it economically feasible, or it's just not, returns are not there. Now, when you try to apply these concepts in the for-profit sector, it's relatively easy. Why? Because we know all these elements. Okay? All the elements to compute these are, or supposedly, are easy to collect. If you're Apple and you're producing iPhones, you should know how many iPhones you sold and at what price. That will give you the revenues, or in general terms, the benefits, and that's it, pretty much, in a very simplistic way. And you should also know more or less how much did it cost to produce these many iPhones and sell them. Okay? We have all the elements there. So this is a sort of a private sector. All the information is there, or if all the information is there, we're good. Okay, that's the for-profit model. Now, when we are in the social sector, things change a little bit, because if you run a program, correctional program or a housing program or any nonprofit intervention, and I ask you, what is it that you produce? Then we can spend hours and hours just trying to define exactly what is it that you produce. You produce reduction in recidivism, or you produce, more housing, people getting help with, substance abuse, for example. And you can, the range of outcomes, I'm changing the word from products to outcomes now, the range can be infinite, from, improving the life of others, like Wilder, the very general mission statement. But some program leaders, you ask them, what's your outcomes? We're making people happier. Okay, good. And you see the difference between that type of definition and an iPhone that you can touch, see, and actually there is a market for it. And that's the second piece of this part over here. Not only is it difficult to define and measure the outcomes, but it's also very difficult to find an economic value for those outcomes. Again, for the iPhone, we have a market, and there are more or less good, the price is a reflection of what the market is saying. And more or less, we have enough information to establish that price. When the program is helping kids to graduate from high school, and then the outcome is an increased level of education or graduating from high school, we ask the question, what is the value of that? What is the economic value of a high school diploma? And then the question is there a market for that? That will tell me what's the price, what is the price for that? And sometimes that you can find a price, sometimes it's not. It gets really, really difficult sometimes to measure this type of outcomes. So the first difference between the original concept from the for-profit sector is that we're talking about outcomes, not products, and then the price is more or less like a value or a shadow price or any other technique that you want to use for measuring that. The cost part is also sometimes a little bit more complicated, because sometimes you have this nonprofit that is receiving funds from the government and then from the private sector, and then they receive in-kind donations, or they even have some sort of a know-how that they want to include in there as a cost, as an input. And you have a lot of volunteer time from lawyers or just people, helping to coordinate or run the program. So we have tangible and intangible costs. That's also true here, but usually when in this framework, the for-profit framework, you just take sort of the financial statements and go with the information that is there. Here we start with that, and then we have to ask the question: do you use volunteers that are contributing to this program or not? Or do you receive any in-kind donations that are not reflected somehow in your statement? Okay, so this is the general framework that we are working with, and we have to figure out a way to measure all these three things. So the main task, like I was saying, going from the program, the intervention, to the value of these outcomes. And plus or minus means that outcomes, or the value of this can go up or down, and then we have to assess if this is a benefit or a cost to society. So each line here, each arrow here, it means we have to find a logic connection. This is what we want to show in our reports and our studies. We want to show that the outcomes that the program is saying they want to achieve are actually coming from their actions and not a random thing. You are really achieving the outcomes that you're saying that you're going to achieve. Okay, so we need to show that connection with some level of a reasonable way of connecting these two. And then the other logic connection is what is the value of these outcomes. So we need to find these two connections. There are several ways of finding out this part over here, and you can find this evidence directly from data collected from participants or from the program. That's usually the preferred way. I mean, you know, you're researchers in some way or another, so data is the big word here. Do you have data? Do you have information on your clients? What type of information you collect? So there are some ways of doing that. We are not going to talk a lot about how to do these kind of things, but we can talk a little bit later. But what about indirect ways of finding this evidence? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Collecting data is expensive, it's costly. If you want to collect data from DHS or the Department of Economic Development and Employment Economic Development, it's also, you have to follow a red tape, it takes time, you have to, sometimes you have to know the right people because it's a huge task sometimes, especially if you're outside the government. If you're inside, it's hard if you're inside, imagine if you're outside. So it may take time, you have to, I mean, it's difficult and costly. Sometimes you don't have time even to do this. I mean, you want to study 3 months from now, and just the data collection will take 6 months, even if it is government data or whatever. That's one way of doing it. Another way is actually collecting data primarily from your participants, you know, doing surveys or collecting data intake forms from intake forms and exit forms and that kind of thing. So we're talking about longitudinal studies, and that take time, are really expensive, and so forth. So what are the indirect ways? Well, we've tried to find evidence from existing studies out there that have shown this connection or a similar connection between programs that are, or interventions that are similar to the program that I'm trying to compute the ROI for, and similar outcomes too. Okay, so here's where things get a little bit muddy, because you say, okay, in your mind is apples to apples. That's the first thing that comes to your mind, and that's the main question. I mean, can we really use this evidence from elsewhere and apply it to the program that I'm trying to analyze? And that has to be always in your mind. Is it reasonable to do this? Is it reasonable? And you have to show your audience that is somewhat reasonable. Okay. And then for this part over here, we need to find the value of the resources that are affected by these actions. If a person is helped or receives help from a program, and let's say the goal of the program was to reduce crime or the likelihood of future crime, then what resources are affected by this outcome? Well, corrections and the police and the judges' time and so forth. Those are the resources I'm talking about. So what's the value of those resources? I'm going to see some examples of that. Any questions so far? Any reactions? So far so good? Yeah, the devil's in the details. So we have this sort of a continuum of estimation when, if you're a consultant or you approach this program and you ask the big question, what type of data do you have on your participants and on your outcomes? And some people will say, nothing, I have nothing. That's very common in the nonprofit sector. Many of the programs only have participation data. They only count people that goes through the door. And that's what they put in their annual reports. How many people do you serve? Some people ask a little bit more. How many women, how many, gender, and some demographic data. And that's it. Some programs ask, like, have a follow-up or an exit form that they ask, well, did you actually found a job? And then the more you ask about this kind of a changes in the conditions that you were trying to solve, then you're getting close to data on outcomes, finding out what the changes in the conditions are. So we move towards the right side, where some programs may have outcome data, changes in the conditions, increase in employment, increase in likelihood of graduation, decrease in recidivism or whatever. Okay? Some even have more cross-section like individual data and so forth. So this is the ideal situation. The reality is that we are somewhere, or most of the programs are somewhere towards the left. Okay? Even government programs, sometimes they lack this. They know a lot about this, but they don't know about outcomes. We are doing an ROI for the Minnesota Council of Veterans, for the Service for Veterans, and the federal government asked them tons and tons of information, but it's all inputs and outputs. Count this, count this, count this, count this, count this. They spend the whole year just counting. When you ask them about outcomes, have no idea. Okay, because they are counting, only counting people. Okay, so that's probably a reality of most nonprofit sectors, and some are moving towards this side. So when we are in this side of the spectrum, we call it, if we compute an ROI, we call it prospective, potential ROI, estimated. You can put a number, whatever name you want. And then we are in this, we use this strategy. We go out somewhere else and try to find evidence of impact parameters. Or if you're in this side, you can do a full ROI or an actual ROI. Different names on it when you actually use data from the participants.
I have a question.
Sure.
To do the full ROI, doesn't it matter how people get in the door? If you want to know if the impact is really because of the program and not something across the door.
Yeah, it does matter. I mean, behind this, I didn't say this, but all these logic connections here, these are research questions, like any other research question. So all the potential biases are an issue that you have to take, like selection bias. Are our participants significantly different from any other participant with the same, any other person with the same characteristics and so forth? So selection bias, attrition bias, all these things are, you have to take into account. So it does matter. But that's one part of the story. But the other part of the story is that this is applied research. So we are not trying to write a paper to get published. This is applied research, so we have to get a number. So you have to compromise sometimes, and you have to be very upfront about these issues. So you say, hey, yeah, there may be some selection bias here. We don't know. We think the direction may be this or that, or we try to reduce it somehow, but this is the number that we have, and move forward. You have to get paid, no? So let's get now we're in the second part, which we're going to jump right into some examples. Excuse me. So when we're talking about evidence from the literature, let's think about ECE, early childhood education. Okay? You're trying to compute the economic benefits of early childhood education. So obviously, you don't want to follow your participants for 20 years like Reynolds did for 20-some years. You want to do it in the next 2 months. So you go to the original source. This is probably the most cited or the most famous example of impact of ECE, child education. And they found that ECE or ECE kids have, this likelihood, I'm going to call it likelihood, this percentage of adult crime by this age and the control group was a little bit higher, so there's a different percentage points or a more or less this percent relative change there. So that's the type of evidence that you have to look for, ideally. So this is a well-respected study. Nobody's going to question Reynolds. Well, nobody. Some people probably would. But it's relatively well respected, so you don't have to find in the name of the Reynolds. I mean, you will use results. That's the idea. So you have two outcomes that they measure: the number of felonies, and then adult crime. So in terms of arrest, in relative terms, these actual things or actually arrests that happen. So one question would be, you're computing your ROI, which number are you going to use here? From out of all these numbers, which one would you like to use? I think. Any idea? Maybe. When this is a good number to use, I think. Remember, we are trying to connect. We have an ECE program in Minnesota. Remember, Reynolds did it in Chicago or I don't know where. So we're trying to apply it here in Minnesota. So that's the tricky part. These two numbers refer to the treatment group in that study, and these controls also from that study from that specific population, specific characteristics and stuff. So this point difference here refers to these two, specifically to this. So we don't want to use this in Minnesota because we don't know how similar the kids in Minnesota are to the kids used here, using the study. So we want to use this or a version of this number, the relative change. So that's the trick. So some people use directly this and say, well, but it's not the same comparison group. So they think that the crime rates in Chicago are not the same crime rates in Minneapolis. Okay. Yeah.
So is the assumption here that the ECE program in Chicago and the ECE program here are the same?
Well, that would be the ideal case. You have to show that it is reasonable. They are reasonably similar. Why or how can you do that? Well, this was if this was Perry School, you have to look at their curriculum, for example, the characteristics of the program, the type of techniques and tools that they use, the level of education of the teachers that they. I mean, you try to know a little bit more about this intervention, and then ask the question how that intervention compares to the intervention that and then you say, well, is the ECE program in Minneapolis high quality like this one? How similar are they? If you feel comfortable with that comparison, then you go ahead. If you don't feel comfortable, scratch that and try to find another evidence. If you don't find any, then that's it. I mean, we cannot go in this direction. So that's the main thing, and that's exactly the question that we have to keep in mind all the time. Can we make this comparison in a reasonable way? The Washington State Institute of Public Policy, they have done this for a while now. We actually try to benchmark this model as close as we can, where they take this evidence, the best evidence out there, and try to combine it with the cost of local resources in Washington. That's what we're trying to do here. That's what the results first is trying to do here in Minnesota. Exactly the same logic behind. So in this case, for early childhood education, they have collected all this information and they have produced this meta-analysis, which is just a survey of studies. So they take studies from many authors and sources, and then try to combine them and have a single number from all of them. In terms of ECE for crime, they only have one, which I think is Reynolds, if I'm correct. For high school graduation, they have 2. They have 17 studies that use this. This ES is the effect size, which is a transform impact parameter. So they try to standardize it and try to account for the quality of the study, the standard error, the sample size, and those kind of things. So they can actually put everything in the same basket. So for crime, for example, this effect size is 25%. This is not percentage points. This is 25% reduction in crime. And they define it like any type of crime measure, which is very general. So it's good for us. Like we can just take the number and use it the way we want for any type of crime. You will see the relevance of this. The other thing that is important is the age. So this means that they measure, for example, this outcome when they were 36, very old people already, very old people, and so forth. And this is important because, especially in this case, when you're trying to project benefits over time for a long period of time, so you have to use present values. So you want to know how many years in the future you have to go to do your discounting. Now, remember the second part of the issue was going from showing evidence that the program was achieving the outcomes, and the second part was showing the value of these outcomes and which resources are affected by these outcomes. So if the program reduces crime, what resources are affected? So in the Washington State Institute of Public Policy, they identify these many sources. So obviously, police resources are affected, the courts or processing and sentencing time, the actual corrections or detention facilities, so forth, and depending on the age of the individual, and then victims' costs. This is the sort of the more fuzzy part of the resources. So what do we need? This is also taken from the Washington Institute model. And what they mean by this is, think about like these 4 parts here. So what is the impact of early childhood on the number of felony arrests? That's the first number that we saw from Reynolds or from their own meta-analysis stuff. So this is just first number. Forget about this for a little bit. Then what is the probability that the resource that we are trying to measure is actually affected by this event? So if you're arrested, what is the likelihood that you're going to be actually brought to in front of a judge, for example, and sentenced? There is a problem. Not everybody that gets caught is brought to in front of a judge or whatever. Sometimes you just spend a day and then go back or get up, whatever. What's the probability of that? And then, what is the number of actual units that result in that? So you have a probability that something happened, and then how we measure that. How many people actually go to jail after they got a sentence? And what type of sentence and so forth. And then finally, what is the cost of that? The actual monetary cost of that. To give you an example, and we do this, now we go back to the sum. We do this for all the resources, all of these resources here. Of course, I don't do not even half of those things because I don't have information on all of those resources and probabilities. I only do it probably for the detention because we know the cost of jail. It's relatively easy to get. It's actually public information. You call and get annual data for the cost of for the per diem cost, for per diem cost of jail in facilities. That's the easy way. You call and ask for the per diem cost. You can do it in a more sophisticated way. You ask for annual operating costs and annual populations, and you run a regression and get the marginal cost of adding one additional inmates in the population. That will be the economist's preferred way of doing it because we like marginal more than average. But that's sometimes not feasible to do. So either way, you just have to be upfront with which number you are using, average or the marginal. And you do it for all the resources that you have data. It's not a big deal if you don't have information on all these resources. It's a big deal in the sense that you're underestimating the cost. But in this type of settings, it's always to be miss the target, from below than overshoot the thing. So you stay in the conservative side. So what we talk about data here, what type of data you need to compute these things. So obviously the probability that a criminal justice resource is used, an example of this is the convictions rate for a felony arrest. And you can get that relatively easy from the web pages and sentencing guidelines and statistical data. I mean, it may take a little bit of digging, and then you get it. Again, what's the probability that the criminal justice resource will be used for a felony? In this case, the incarceration. So one first step is you have to get a sentence, and then how likely are you to end up in jail, actually in jail? So again, sentencing guidelines and that kind of thing. Then the units. This is the number of units. This is how many days are you going to spend in jail if you are sentenced and sent to jail. So you have all these steps that you have to think about. And finally, this is the number that I was talking about. You can get it from the regression, or you can use the per diem cost. Okay. So what is behind the cost of crime? If you want to do it the way they do it and the way I do it, it is usually this way. What happens when people try to do it sort of a back of the envelope ROI, which I try to say, hey, don't do it, please. You're going to hurt yourself. They just say, we avoided 3 incarcerations and multiply by the per diem, and boom, that's your ROI. That's at least the benefit side.
So for this particular example, but I think it comes up other ways, wouldn't an important element of the equation be the race of the individuals? Because your probability for being arrested and your length of time is, has a racial element.
Again, we go back to the research question. What's the population that we are talking about here? That's important. So these probabilities may be very different for different populations. So you have to be clear about who you're talking about. Now, again, going back to the apply word, sometimes you just can't differentiate this much. So you have to go with overall populations and say, this is for the overall population, although the program focuses on minorities or a specific population, this is for the overall population, and you go with it.
Could it be that Hennepin County might have that data representing that population?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. As I want it in the equation.
Yeah.
Right. But then again, you may run into difficulties if you have one parameter for one population and another parameter for the general population, and they start mixing them up. So you want to be as consistent as you can. So sometimes you can find some of these by race and some of them just for the, and then you say, oh, should I mix them or not? So a lot of judgment calls that you have to make. So this is sort of so you see a number, that's the tip of the iceberg, and then you have to think about this thing. Now, this model here, I mean, if you think about the logic here, is, again, it's a general framework. It's going from what is the impact of this program, and then what is the economic value. But between them, you always have to think about what are the resources that you're using, what's the likelihood that we are actually going to use these resources, and how are we measuring these resources in terms of units, days in jail, or people showing in court, people actually sentenced to jail, and so forth. you can take this model and apply it to any outcome. And we'll see another example later on to see. Go ahead.
So on your last there, I think that will help us understand. I think some of the questions were talking about the impact model and the variable control for the impact model versus what goes into an ROI model. So can you talk about where the model for the evaluation of the impact of the program itself fits within the model for the ROI analysis?
Yeah, they have to go hand in hand in the sense that the impact evaluation, I mean, I always love to see a good impact evaluation because I don't have to do this thing, right? If you give me a good impact parameter, well, I still have to do part of this and to actually find out the value. But the first number, the 23% reduction, got it. So I don't have to make this huge assumption about comparing, parent school to your program. So if I can avoid that, great. So a good impact parameter, impact evaluation is key. But again, as I say, it's really hard to find a good one. A good one, not in the bad sense, is that it's really difficult to have comparison groups or good, control groups in this setting. So you have to go with. Sometimes you go around and do some sort of a pre-post type of analysis, quasi-experimental things, and all these kind of ways around when you don't have a nice control group. But that's the first part. To answer your question, you first think about this evidence and how you show it. If you can do it with an impact evaluation and how good that evaluation is, it's really important. Well, if you plug in the numbers, you get this type of numbers. These are dollars. So at the end, you're talking about $5,000 that you can reasonably attribute to early childhood education programs per kid, I guess. That goes to, again, the age is important because you're discounting. This line here is somewhat tricky because a lot of these are intangible things, like how you feel about being robbed, or how emotional, affected you were after, you were a victim of crime. So there are all sort of quality studies around that. I mean, some good, some not so good. So you have to pick a good one, I guess, or a good one that you feel comfortable with. This you can do with property loss information from crime data. So what's the average property loss from felony type of crimes and so forth. So you can more or less approximate that. Of course, not everything is reported and so forth. I mean, all sort of caveats on this thing. So sometimes, if you want to be really conservative, you just scratch the whole cost to victims, scratch it off, and go with the cost of jail and whatever you actually know more about. If you're more, or either confident that these numbers are more or less reasonable, go ahead and do it. So an example, the North Side Achievement Zone, NAS study that we did last year, we found this huge ROI. This intervention specifically is a very complex intervention. They do a lot of things. They try to tackle families and education and the community and all employment, all sort of intervention that's going on at the same time. So conducting the ROI is really, really tricky. They also are in the initial phases of the study, so we don't know what the outcomes will be. So this is a very good example of potential or prospective ROI that we did.
What do you use NAS for your comparison?
We use all sort of the statistics for the geographical area where they are working with, the neighborhood. So sometimes to the zip code level, so crime rates, health, graduation rates, we plug it from specifically from that geographic area.
Can you go back to that previous slide for a second?
Sure. That.
Okay. So I'm looking at this figure that you presented here, and when we went back several slides earlier, when you were showing the impact information, you had standard errors there. Right. So is there a confidence interval of some kind around this number that you're presenting here? And if so, what is it?
I didn't compute it, but you could do it. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. It depends on if the client wants me to have a range. We use a standard, exactly that. We use a standard errors and create a confidence. Say what's the likelihood of this average falls between the two ranges. Sometimes we do it using standard error. Sometimes we just do it by an ad hoc range. Like say, what if we miss targets by 10% up and down? So is the ROI still good? I mean, positive. So we can do it with an ad hoc, discount or range, or using the standard errors. One thing with the standard errors is that it's not exactly the probability that we're going to get this. It's just a chance that if we draw another sample, then we're going to get similar results. So it's not exactly a good range. The good way, the right way would be doing what they do at the Washington State, which is using probabilistic models and doing some Monte Carlo stuff. That will tell you the likelihood of getting a number close to this. I don't usually do that. I think it's probably too much for the money. Okay. But we use ranges sometimes. Not for this one. I don't think we have a range for this, at least within a report. I may have it somewhere. So for this case, we computed benefits for all these outcomes from all these, they call it solutions, interventions, ECE, early childhood, or, sure, I forgot what they mean, but employment or something, I can't remember the interventions here. And that's more or less now think about this number here. This is a huge thing. This is a very common outcome. So in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I want to show you this. So think about, it's an example, another example, residential treatment programs for youth with behavioral issues. So for the residential programs, we had a little bit of data, participation data, so we computed some effectiveness rates, so we were good with that. But for the future programs, we don't have any impact parameters from participation because there's no participation yet. So we use the prospective model here. Okay, so millions of dollars, so they were good with that. How we got these numbers? Just think about, we got it from all these interventions here. So again, it was the same logic. I asked them, okay, this intervention that you are planning on doing, which model of behavioral or therapies are you going to use for these new kids? And then the question was, is there any evidence that these therapies actually work? And I went back and you do the lead research or go to the Washington State, see if they did it. That's my first step before spending so much time. If they did it, I don't have to, I can tap into that. What about this specific outcome, for example? So I think that these programs actually help kids to finish high school. So again, we're going same logic. Is the program effective? So I found evidence that the programs actually help participants in this particular outcome, externalizing behavior symptoms. Okay, that's what and this is also from the Washington State. If you go to their webpage, you can see this data. So that's our first step. So it seems that it's working at least for these outcomes or this set of outcomes. Okay, and they were using, in this case, what's very specific, they actually use this type of therapy all the time. So they say that they can reduce these symptoms by almost 30%. Okay, that's what the meta-analysis says. But that doesn't take us to the other side of the equation where the value is. Not even close. Okay, so there is another intermediate step, and we know that when people reduces their symptoms, or at least externalizing these behaviors, they actually more likely to graduate from high school. So second step, program works reducing the externalization of the symptoms. Then this produce, or if you are in trouble with this, if you actually show these bad symptoms, then you're less likely to graduate from high school. You have to be very careful with the direction of the effect in this case. Okay, the first effect is positive, and the second effect is negative. So you have to be careful with the sign of the line. And then more details here, but so you know that high school graduation will be improved if you reduce your externalization, right? So how do we know this? And remember, these are kids, like they are 16 years old, 17 years old in average. So they have a lifelong, many years in the future for. So this is a time when you have to, estimate benefits in the future and then got them back in present value. So let's think about this data first. These are average annual income for these age groups and these educational level groups. So if you go to the current population survey, the census, you can actually get data for these two groups. It is actually micro data. So you have tons of observations for each person in a particular geographic area that you can choose. In this case, with Minnesota, it's for the whole state because they serve people around the state. Of course, if you take that data from the census, it's all jumpy, it's all dots in a grid. So it's not really good to make this lifelong estimation. So you have to do what you're seeing here is a smooth transformation of those data points. We also account for growth in the wages, the fringe benefits, and a little bit of inflation too there. So we try to account for those stuff. So these numbers here are not exactly the numbers that you get from the census. There are a little bit of work behind those. This difference is just these numbers subtracted from each other, and this is the important number here. This is the difference, and then again, you see the same logic. This is the value of the units of the outcome, the actual change in the difference in income. This is the direct effect. This is the effect of the program on reducing externalization. And then this is the indirect effect. So it's how much this reduced externalization increases or reduces the chances of high school graduation. Okay? So again, instead of one effect size, now we have two. This is a sort of a logic connection. And this is just the discount rate. So you want to bring back from this year to participation year. If you are, this is assuming that everybody, I mean, we're counting the day-to-day half 16 years old. If you are thinking they are getting into the program when they are like, 4 or 5 years, then you have to go back a few more years back in the present value and so forth. So you have to be, a lot of details you have to think about. Okay? So this is the smooth lines that I was talking about. So you take the census data, and then these are probabilistic or lines, smooth lines created with probabilistic functions for each of these groups, and this is the income, and this is the age. Of course, these are not, I mean, maybe exaggerated or not, depending on how good your fit is in the data. But it gives you an idea of what's going on And we are looking for the difference between high school and these guys, less than high school, I think. These guys, somebody talked about race. These are black individuals with less than high school. So this is everybody with less than high school is black. So it's even worse for them. So it matters. If you going to that direction. Okay. So things that we need to consider when we try to do these type of things. Obviously, availability of evidence from the program. If there is no evidence, then we cannot do anything about it. The direct or the indirect ways of doing it. Obviously, cost of resources, redeem costs, or the probability of use. Remember, the probability is always, the probability of this resource being used is something that people miss sometimes, so it's important to keep it in mind. Always keep in mind the alternative of the comparison. It's always a research question, so what's my point of reference? That's very important too. And that's it. If you want to comment or anything, you can do it those two ways. Comments?
The NANS, I've read some, but not all of your really long report on your website. Was there any thought given to similar geography and Minneapolis on the same fall that has reasonably similar demographics and just following statistics on that alternative, what you might call a control group? Was there any thought given to that?
No, not well. Not that I know about. I was on the the ROI team. Ellen Shelton and other part of the team was into the actual program evaluation that they're actually running right now. So I don't know what the comparison group is for their evaluation. I really don't know.
Looking at other children in the neighborhood that aren't involved in that program. They do have a control group.
Yeah, they do have some, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Control group or comparison? They're randomly assigned in command.
No, there's like it's not a random control group, but they're following kids who are in the NASDAQ and it's in the same zone that are not in the NASDAQ.
Yeah, so it's,
What is, to the extent that we wrestle with this in human services in the county a lot, is mobile population. And I provide the preliminary data for ASHU with human services within that area. And it's a particular area, another area that really next history is actually a very mobile population. So we have geographic intervention, but it looks like it's the same people who live there, but when we wrestle with it. So it's,
yeah.
now, I mean, if you apply a treatment and the person moves elsewhere, you would assume that that's what it is, but that's your measurement of your result because you have different people.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Complicated.
I'm curious, I mean, is that something you just kind of ignore?
No,
or,
no.
Or do you try to factor that?
Yeah, we actually do it sometimes for when we do we call it the one-child dividend studies. Is what's the benefit of providing early child education to one additional child? We have done it for Minnesota and other states. And in that case, we are considering in and out migration. So it's just a discount that we did. I mean, how many people is actually getting out and how many kids are getting in that they are not in ECE and so forth. So the simplest way is just like we did with it's an ad hoc. I mean, you could do it using the demographic in and out, migration data, or you can just reduce it by some percentage and so forth. But we know about it. We do something about it as much as we can. Yeah.
So I've seen some ROI analysis done that incorporates like choice theory for the likelihood, especially if people are selecting themselves in the program to account for the decision making that goes into that. Would that fit into the probability part of the model, or where would you?
I would put in the first stage when you are trying to measure the impact of the program. and trying to decide who's your treatment group and who's your comparison group or you know, benchmark. And then see how likely is that, you know, bias to happen in that particular program. And you go from there. For example, if you're you know, you're measuring a program and then you have a waiting list, that's sort of the ideal kind of a source for a control group because they're very similar to your participants. So you avoid a little bit of that bias. Otherwise, you can always use like more econometric tricks, like, you know, any trick that you have in your bag if you have any. So for that type of things, like, you know, 6 effects or whatever you want to do. Or, you know.
We're at 1 o'clock, so I'll wrap up questions there. Thanks very much to Jose for presenting today. Wrap? Okay. Thanks, everyone.